The Final Fantasy franchise has just had its 37th anniversary. Over the past nearly 4 decades, countless games associated with the franchise have been released, and they've spanned a variety of consoles and genres. But as systems evolved, older games were often left behind. This meant that if people didn't play games on their original release systems, playing them became near impossible, as backwards compatibility wasn't even a thing for many years. This was where ports came in, however. As Square sought to build out their franchise, even though Sakaguchi was always focused on the future and the creation of bigger and better properties, there was also an acceptance that people wanted to play older games that were no longer accessible. Right after the release of Final Fantasy VII, this saw the first major port of a Final Fantasy game released, as Square went to market with Final Fantasy IV for the PlayStation, with Final Fantasy V and VI following soon after. But as Square started to suffer financial troubles towards the back end of the decade, porting started to become more of a necessity than a luxury. Ever since then, ports have happened with a high degree of frequency, and as of right now, it means that games like the original Final Fantasy have been released under numerous guises more than 10 individual times. And while some of these may have been straight ports with no modifications made, others have seen numerous quality of life enhancements and even bonus content added. But not all ports of Final Fantasy games have been successful endeavours, and it's those ports that we're going to be running through in this video. So with the usual caveat that we'll only be covering one port per game, we're going to start with one of the earliest ports. Yes, the infamous port of Final Fantasy VI for the PlayStation. Final Fantasy VI launched on the PlayStation in Japan on the 11th of March 1999. The idea was to make the game accessible for those who had either missed out on the Super Famicom version or just wanted to experience the game again with a few extra bells and whistles. Even though Square had overseen the production of a modified version of the game in the form of the North American version though, the original Super Famicom version was used as a base for the PlayStation port. That's not to say that quality of life improvements weren't made, however. Numerous bugs and glitches were fixed, with certain abilities and relics also balanced. And following the ports of Final Fantasy IV and V, high-quality FMV sequences were also created. These helped to bring the 2D characters to life, and ensure that those who were playing Final Fantasy VI for the first time, presumably after also playing either Final Fantasy VII or VIII, felt a bit more at home with the experience. The major downside, however, was that Final Fantasy VI was not designed for the PlayStation infrastructure, and this also applied to Final Fantasy IV and V, and even Chrono Trigger. As a ROM-based platform, the Super Famicom had lightning-quick load times, and this enabled fast transitions between the various scenes that were adopted. Nobuo Uematsu even spoke about this concern when working on Final Fantasy VII, as the CD-ROM format was notorious for its slowness, and this led to the famed composer using the PlayStation Sounds chip as opposed to using the pre-recorded linear PCM format, as it meant music could be played in real time. The consequence of this was that the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy VI had much slower load times than the original. This could be evidenced by the game's very first encounter. On the Super Famicom, it loaded in around 2 seconds, but on the PlayStation version, it loaded in around 6 seconds. With so many encounters taking place during a complete playthrough of the game, this meant playtimes could considerably increase, and this notion was further exacerbated by the same problems happening when loading the menu screen. By the time the European port was launched some 3 years later, work had been done to optimize this issue. But for those who had experienced the original Super Famicom or Super Nintendo version, it was a serious point of frustration. When Final Fantasy VII launched on PC in 1999, Eidos had seemingly performed some kind of miracle. They had managed to create a functioning version of the game despite numerous obstacles, and this helped to open up Final Fantasy to a whole new audience. Due to the success of the port, Eidos were commissioned to work on a PC port of Final Fantasy VIII, and just as they had done with the port of VII, they made a significant number of changes. On the positive side, the game featured content that was previously soft region locked, such as the Chocobo World minigame, which required the use of the Pocket Station. It should be said that it was still possible to play Chocobo World outside of Japan, but the Pocket Station was never officially released in North America or Europe, so most people never had the chance. The game also featured much higher quality character models and in-game portraits, and in general had faster load times, but many other issues were introduced. Perhaps the most grating was the music. Much like the PC port of Final Fantasy VII, delivery of the music relied on the sound card the user had installed, but the results for Final Fantasy VIII were far less appealing in this regard. This meant the quality of the music suffered greatly, and it did not compare well against the PlayStation version of the soundtrack. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect, however, related to frame rates. Every aspect of the game used different frame rates, including the field and FMV sequences, but the battle scene was reduced down to 15 frames per second, and with this particular battle system requiring players to time inputs such as squalls, Renzokuken limit break, this meant hitting the right timing point was made much more difficult. Over the years, the modding community has done a fantastic job of fixing up this original port, but when it launched back in the year 2000, its performance was less than ideal. When it was announced that a new Dissidia project was underway, it led to a lot of excitement. The franchise had been a huge success on the PlayStation Portable, and this new game looked stunning. At the time, it was revealed that this new Dissidia was being developed by Team Ninja, and it was first going to release in Japanese arcades. They also revealed that its codename was Project Decade, not only because it merged Dissidia with arcade, but because it signified their intention for the game to have a 10-year life cycle. When the game then launched in arcades, it was a huge success. Square Enix managed to sell more than 3,000 arcade cabinets, and this generated huge amounts of revenue. This success only heightened the sense of anticipation outside of Japan, as never before had the Dissidia franchise graced home consoles. And there was also an assumption, given how long the port was taking, that the experience would be built upon to make the ultimate Dissidia game. However, some of that optimism started to dampen when Dissidia NT was first shown off. Those who played the game at trade shows felt it was quite confusing, as there were numerous issues around the user interface. This was temporarily counterbalanced by the news that Kazushika Nojima was penning a brand new story. But it was then revealed that the story was going to be simply a collection of sequences as opposed to a proper story mode like in the previous two games. Part of the challenge was that from the perspective of consumers, the arcade model worked. As Koji Ryoka noted back in 2016, players could simply go to an arcade, money in hand, and always be able to play the most up-to-date version of the game. Everyone had the same experience, the cost was the same no matter how much extra content was added. But with a home console version, the balance was different. The upfront cost was much higher, and consumers were charged extra when new content was added, such as new characters, and this was a way of bringing in extra revenue despite the player base always declining. To counteract this, they wanted to make sure the home console version launched with extra content and a much bigger roster of characters, as this would then justify the inflated price of entry. But the PS4 port of Dissidia Final Fantasy left a lot to be desired. Only 13 of the 75 professional critics who reviewed the game could recommend it, and sales ended up being very poor in comparison to either of the PSP entries. Due to the quality of the home console port, Square Enix were already on the back foot. The player base was much lower than they had anticipated, and the competitive scene they'd hoped would materialise just wasn't there. A year later, they then launched a free-to-play version of Dissidia NT on PC. But this port also suffered from numerous issues itself, and currently sits at a 44% recommendation on Steam. 1 year after Dissidia NT went free-to-play, Square Enix then decided to stop supporting all versions of the game. But they are still available to play if you want to try them out. When the PC port of Final Fantasy XIII arrived on the 9th of October 2014, it came with a myriad of problems relating to frame rates, resolutions, controller support, and even inaccessible ways of exiting the game. If there was any kind of issue you might expect from a bad PC port, they were almost all found here. As noted by the PC Gaming Wiki, these issues stemmed from Square Enix's inability to adjust the game suitably for the new platform. As the original game was developed for the PlayStation 3 and its specific cell processor, many of the development techniques that were used just weren't applicable to PCs. This meant that resource management was incredibly poor, leaving the CPU and GPU underutilized, and performance therefore suffered. But even though this port wasn't great, the port of Final Fantasy XIII-2, which launched a few months later, felt even worse. Some of the problems that plagued the 13 port had been fixed, but others had been introduced. For example, some players were unable to get the game's launcher to even launch, which then meant they couldn't change any of the game's settings, as nothing could be changed from within the game itself. There were also numerous audio and visual issues, and even now, some 8 years on, some of the issues still haven't been fixed on the Steam version. Perhaps the weirdest aspect though is that the version purchasable on the Microsoft Store isn't the same as the Steam version. It's a different build of the game, which is much more stable, and even features some enhancements. After the successful releases of the Final Fantasy III and IV remakes, and Final Fantasy IV on the PlayStation Portable, Square Enix sought to try and figure out how they could do the same with Final Fantasy V and VI. Both had had strong releases on the Game Boy Advance, but Square Enix wanted to create something else, and first sought to produce remakes similar to 3 and 4. The initial challenge, however, was that the team who created those remakes no longer wanted to work on them. They wanted to make a new Final Fantasy property. Square Enix therefore attempted to find a new development partner to support them with their ambitions, but their attempts fell flat, and after numerous false dawns, they were forced to abandon their plans. Many years later, however, Final Fantasy V was somewhat remade, just not quite in the format that people were expecting. Instead of following suit with remakes of Final Fantasy III and IV, they instead chose to produce a new 2D version of the game that was adapted from Final Fantasy V Advance and was planned to release on smartphones. In theory, it should have been the most comprehensive version of the game ever created, but fans had issues with how it looked. Instead of adopting the crisp 2D visuals seen with the PlayStation Portable versions of Final Fantasy I, II, and IV, Square Enix chose to mimic the visuals seen within Final Fantasy Dimensions. It saw new sprites designed by Kazuko Shibuya, but the reception to the change in graphical style was somewhat controversial. It led to a disconnect between the characters and the world around them, as they looked far too detailed in comparison. The backgrounds also ended up looking odd due to poor texture placement. Further issues then came when this game was ported to the PC, as they didn't even attempt to hide the fact this version was designed for iOS and Android devices first. It meant alongside the character sprites, which people didn't like, they also had to put up with the same UI. Critics were quite damning, with COG saying that it was simply just a very terrible mobile port that appears to have been given a full screen mode to work on PC without any extra work or quality assurance at all. This version of the game stayed live on Steam until the Pixel Remaster version became available, at which point Square Enix completely delisted it. This does, of course, sound like the logical thing to do, but we also have to bear in mind that despite releasing Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, you can also still buy the original Final Fantasy VIII Steam version, so it's probably more that they realised the Steam port of Final Fantasy V just wasn't a good look for them. After its original release on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy IX didn't see a formal re-release for almost 2 decades. Yes, it could be purchased on the PlayStation Network as a classic game, but the version of Final Fantasy IX that was first released on iOS and Android devices was a complete remake of the original. As shared by Shinji Hashimoto, who was the then brand manager for the Final Fantasy franchise, the team rebuilt Final Fantasy IX from the ground up using the Unity engine. They then used that to port Final Fantasy IX to various modern-day systems, with iOS and Android devices coming first and Steam second, before the PlayStation 4 version arrived 18 months later. Fans who wanted to play Final Fantasy IX on the Xbox and Switch, though, had to wait a full 3 years after those original smartphone versions, and what they were presented with wasn't even that great. First, very few of the bugs reported in any of the 3 previous versions had been fixed, but it also suffered from much slower load times and a whole host of other issues that were detailed here months after it launched. Perhaps the issue that grated people the most, though, was that the field music restarted from the beginning after every random battle. This hadn't been a thing since Final Fantasy V on the Super Famicom, when a sound programmer called Miroru Akao spent ages figuring out how to have the field music continue playing where it left off after a battle concluded. But with a Switch port of Final Fantasy IX, they just reverted back to how it was almost 30 years prior. The good news was that this issue did eventually get fixed, but many of the other issues still remained. And although the game is perfectly playable, it's frustrating that the best way to play Final Fantasy IX is either just loading up the original PlayStation version or using wonderfully crafted mods on the PC version, such as the Mogri mod. That then brings us to our last entry, the PC port of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Much was, of course, made of Final Fantasy VII Remake when it launched on the PlayStation 4, with numerous texture issues cropping up that ended up being quite infamous. Many of these issues were then fixed when the game arrived on the PlayStation 5 via Final Fantasy VII Remake Integrate, but the PC port ended up bringing a whole host of new challenges to the mix. It led to a ton of uproar at the time, with Alexander Battaglia, one of the Digital Foundry team, saying that he refused to even cover the game because of the performance issues that happened during some of the game's opening cinematic sequences. Other publications were also damning, with Eurogamer calling it a disappointing, bare-bones port, and The Verge commenting that it just about got the job done, as it felt as though Square Enix had done the absolute bare minimum. Many of these issues did end up getting fixed, but it still took some time. For example, a stuttering issue encountered by people using DirectX 12 took a few months to fix after the game launched on the Epic Games Store. By the time the game had then launched on Steam, some 6 months later, Square Enix and Nvidia had worked on a bunch of fixes, and the PC port is now in a much better place. But it's a shame the initial launch wasn't given the same level of care and attention. With that though, they are 7 of the worst Final Fantasy ports we've had to endure over the years. But were there any we didn't cover that you feel deserved a place on this list instead? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to give it a like. If you enjoyed the content we produce, why not also subscribe to the channel? Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, the Livestream, and Suk and DDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.